Let's talk about what might just be the single most debated event in all of ancient history. For 2,000 years, one question has absolutely captivated and divided historians, theologians, and thinkers. What really happened to the body of Jesus of Nazareth? Today, we're going to put on our historian hats and approach this not as a matter of faith, but as a genuine historical investigation. Okay, so there's one thing that pretty much everyone agrees on. Mainstream historians, whether they're Christian or not, overwhelmingly accept this as fact. A man named Jesus was executed by the Romans. This is the historical bedrock we can all stand on. And that is the central mystery, isn't it? The claims his followers made after his death, well, they turned a tiny local movement into a global religion. So how in the world do modern historians try to figure this out? How do they sift through the evidence? Let's start by looking at one of the most popular academic arguments out there. To try and build a case using only the tools of history, some scholars use what's known as the minimal facts approach. The whole point is to build an argument using only the details that even the biggest skeptics would have to agree are historically solid. So the idea here is to strip away anything you'd have to take on faith. You focus only on the data points that have a really broad consensus among scholars, especially what are called critical scholars, academics who look at these ancient texts without any pre-existing belief that they're divinely inspired. The thinking goes, if you can build a case on facts that almost everyone accepts, your conclusion is going to be way more powerful. All right, so what are these supposed core facts? Well, proponents point to these 5. They claim each one is backed up by such strong evidence that most scholars are on board. You've got the crucifixion, which we've covered, then the disciples' sincere belief that he rose and appeared to them, and then 3 really interesting ones: the sudden conversion of Paul, a guy who was actively hunting Christians, the equally sudden conversion of Jesus' own skeptical brother, James, and finally, the claim that the tomb was found empty. Okay, this passage right here, this is a huge piece of the puzzle. Most scholars believe this little creed dates to within just a few years of the crucifixion. That's insane. It's like a historical fossil, an incredibly early snapshot of what the very first followers were saying out loud. He died, was buried, was raised, and then appeared to people, including his own brother James, who didn't even believe in him before this. So you take early sources like that, and others, and the people who use the minimal facts approach, they make a pretty bold claim. They say the historical data is so convincing that it's won over the majority of the academic world. But, how true is that really? This is the big statistic you hear all the time. A 3-to-1 majority of critical scholars supposedly accept the empty tomb as a historical fact. And look, that sounds incredibly powerful, right? It seems to put some serious academic muscle behind the case. But like any good investigation, you gotta dig a little deeper into the numbers. And this is where things get really interesting, because a counter-argument has emerged. Some researchers decided to actually analyze the data that these consensus claims are built on. And what they found, well, it throws a bit of a wrench in the whole premise. So, get this. A recent analysis looked at over 700 English-language books on the resurrection published over the last 5 centuries. A staggering 92.5% of them argue for the resurrection. At first glance, you'd think, wow, case closed, the consensus is even stronger than we thought. But not so fast, because that leads us to the real million-dollar question here. A consensus only matters if it comes from a representative group of experts. So who is actually writing all these books? And when the researchers broke down who the authors were, they found something pretty striking. A massive chunk of them came from a few key occupations. Hundreds were seminary professors, ministers, and priests. So here's the rebuttal in a nutshell. Critics argue the sample is totally skewed. You can't poll a group of authors who are overwhelmingly Christian clergy and then claim you have a consensus of all critical scholars. The data, they say, doesn't necessarily reflect the state of secular academia, but rather the publishing landscape for this specific topic. Okay, so if that whole consensus claim is maybe on shaky ground, we're back to looking at the evidence itself. And this is where the debate gets so interesting, because both sides often look at the exact same historical events and come to radically different conclusions. So, take the disciples. 1 minute they're a terrified group hiding for their lives, and the next they're boldly preaching in public, willing to die for their message. Why? The minimal facts view says the best explanation is that they actually saw the risen Jesus. People will die for what they believe is true, but they won't die for something they know they just made up. The critical view, though, suggests a psychological explanation. Maybe Peter, racked with guilt over denying Jesus, had a powerful grief-induced vision. And that experience was so intense that when he shared it, it spread like fire to the other devastated followers. And what about the empty tomb? Proponents bring up what's called the criterion of embarrassment. In that culture, a woman's testimony wasn't considered very reliable. So why on earth would you invent a story where women are your star witnesses? The fact that it's an embarrassing detail suggests it's probably true. But on the flip side, scholars like Bart Ehrman argue the opposite. They suggest the belief started with visions, and later the story of an empty tomb was added to make it clear this wasn't just a spiritual vision, it was a physical, bodily resurrection. So where does all this leave us? We have the same texts, the same core events, but two completely different conclusions. And that tells you that the disagreement here runs a lot deeper than just the evidence itself. And this really gets to the heart of it. For the most part, scholars on both sides are working from the same sources. The real dividing line is philosophical. It all comes down to your worldview, what you consider a possible explanation for things in the first place. You know, this quote from the influential scholar E.P. Sanders, who is not a Christian, is just so telling. He says it's a historical fact that the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of a risen Jesus. Think about that. He's saying something profound and transformative absolutely happened to them. The historical debate isn't over if they had these experiences, it's over what caused them. And that leaves us right at the edge with the ultimate question. The historical method can tell us what probably happened based on testimony and texts. It can confirm a crucifixion, it can affirm the disciples' sincere belief, and it can document the explosion of a new movement. But can it cross that line? Can it prove a miracle? Or is that where the historian's job ends and the individual's own leap of faith begins? That's the boundary this entire debate walks.